Michael, a quick question for you. I find myself, even with a bit of base knowledge on what you're talking about, and most of my listeners do also, still very dumbified down and brainwashed and basically manipulated in a way to where I do understand, but I find myself learning new every day, but it's still, the brainwashing has done its job well as far as I'm concerned. So even open people, being pagan or into astrology even, are so blinded to what's really going on. And why is this?
That's right. Exactly concur with that. That, I do my work, and I have many, many great people, thousands of people, and mostly they're from the middle class. But, I have very few hippies, or very few Wicca, or any of these people who claim to be, so open-minded, ever contacting us. I've yet to see a hippie turn up at one of my talks. Yet you'd think that those would be the first people, because ostensibly, openly, aren't they meant to be the free thinkers? No, they're some of the most closed-minded, lost souls that exist. And the same goes, excuse me for being so blunt, with a lot of the other groups that are meant to be paganistic or whatever, So, they're not going to ask any questions because they think they've got their little thing. They've got their little ego pacifier. They've got their little narcissistic trip going there, which is basically a fashion. I mean, it's nothing more than a fashion. That's all. It's just a long-standing fashion. And therefore, they're content. They don't want to be using their brain at all. But the real reason why, there's a resistance from even people that might be referred to as open-minded normally is because this is a long-standing campaign. It's a drip-feed kind of tranquilization of the human race. And probably also, if people have followed my work in Atlantis, they will remember that I have a theory about the human ego that follows on from Julian Jaynes and from Terence McKenna's research, and some of these individuals who have noticed purely biologically and also through scientific tests, not metaphysical, but physical testing of the brain, has shown that it's rooted in trauma. Sigmund Freud was, of course, the first to really discover this, that many of the diseases and illnesses and proclivities and neuroses of the earth, of the brain, of the mind, seem to be hereditary. They seem to have been rooted in the limbic past. They seem to come from a deep place, historically, in which there was a traumatic type of situation. We all realize that when a child is born, to give a physical example, we understand that the birth of a child is very traumatic. Well, now try to take that kind of feeling of trauma to the ego itself. I know it's a little bit difficult to understand, but the mind itself, consciousness, thinking, waking consciousness, was not the same that we have now, even 2,000-3,000 years ago, and it certainly was not the same 11,000 years ago. Now, the American genius who spoke on this is Julian Jaynes. But many other people, like Alan Watts and Terry Kellogg and other writers, have also started to question this, but they are not able to put their finger on what is the primal trauma. In my work, I show that fear of the dark and fear of loneliness and fear of noises in the sky and a fear of certain insects and a fear of the ocean, these are all physiological. Because once upon a time, about 13,500 years from where we are now, this earth was wrecked with devastation and polar shifting that was so monumentally catastrophic that it not only nearly physically wiped out the entire flora and fauna of the world, and we don't have time to explain all this, it's in the book and in the Atlantis DVD, but it caused severe psychic deremption, severe psychosis in the human mind, to the extent that I believe it's like, imagine an earthquake taking place within. It's like an average fear reaction. Say you're walking in town and you get mugged, or you think of somebody's breaking into your house or something like that, or you're just about to hit somebody's car, and you jump, you have that fear reaction. Okay, now magnify that kind of reaction thousands of times, and magnify it collectively so it's experienced by all mankind basically simultaneously. You can't even draw a picture of it. Freud sensed it because he was attuned to observing psychology, and almost anyone else who has done their homework in psychology, particularly people like R.D. Laing and most of the psychologists, even though they may not mention it, they are fully aware of the fragility of the ego. And I believe, I come in and I use their theories and say, yeah, well, I can explain this fragility of the ego. What you call ego was actually once upon a time a stabilizing mechanism in consciousness, meaning that consciousness was completely shot to death. You can imagine that it was just clubbed. The trauma had basically frozen the kind of consciousness that our ancestors experienced. And so, in fact, it was a death. There was a death of consciousness and a rebirth of another kind of consciousness that we today refer to as ego consciousness. And the reason why this is important is for two reasons. All gods and Christ-like figures that are put in front of us began as children, began as little son children. You always see Krishna as the baby in his mother's arms. You always see that with Vishnu. You always see that with Jesus. You see that with King Arthur. You see that with Horus. You see that with Quetzalcoatl and many of the South American deities. What's the idea of this little infant? It's because these stories are myths of not of the creation of individual gods, but of the God, the ego being born as an innocent, fragile infant that has the forces of darkness preying upon it. So when you see the sun disk as a young sun, and the Christ is always connected to the young solar disk rising on the horizon, he's the newborn, nascent sun. This is a symbol in itself for the ego, the birth of the ego itself. Now, another way and the other reason why it's important is because the ego replaced the old consciousness that died. My work with 2012 is showing that we might be coming up on the second event of that. That the countdown to the end of the age of Pisces and the end of the Mayan calendar, 2012, might be, and I'm one of the only people who's speculated on this, is that we might be heading for another conclusion of the ego that took place 13,000 years ago, the kind of consciousness that begins, comes to its peak, and then, closes, and that, of course, is articulated to civilization, might also be coming into its close. I'm convinced of it because I can see the symptoms of it now. I've been seeing the symptoms of it since 1985 when I first started researching this. So that's the second reason. But the most important thing is this. The example that I like to give, and it's not a very good example, but it might do the trick, is that say you're walking on the street and suddenly you're about to fall because you slip on something. And your body goes completely limp and you're about to fall. Does not your legs or your hand or whatever that stabilize stiffen, right? There's an immediate spastic reaction, is there not, so that you can prevent yourself from being injured, right?
Oh, yeah. I experienced that this last Sunday, in fact.
Is that right?
Yeah, my shoulders got hyperextended from about a 10-foot fall, and I extended my arm.
And what happens to the muscle? It becomes spastic, right? It becomes taut. And sometimes it can freeze to the extent where the myofascia and the muscle itself can remain in that state, correct?
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember the actual technical term for that, but I think it's like what happens when it almost freezes, so it's knotted, it's very knotted?
I'm not sure what the term is, but that's what my shoulder is, that's for sure. I'm feeling what you're talking about, that's for sure.
Right, everybody knows that experience. Now, that's a physical muscle. What we've got to do to understand what I'm talking about is transfer in our mind the idea that the ego is nothing more than a muscle. It's just an energetic muscle. Consciousness is flexed. You have muscles in your eye, and you have muscles in your consciousness. And when we flex that muscle, it's called thinking. If you think of the human consciousness and the human thought and the human brain as an energetic muscle, you're going to really discover something amazing. That this thing, as you know, works the more you use it. So the ego is the kind of muscle that immediately propped up mankind when it was about to completely just go belly up. All right? This thing was heading for the ground. Consciousness was completely frozen, traumatized, catatonic, out to lunch, dead, gone. But the human being and his mind and his consciousness, as well as his body, is an incredibly compensatory organism. And what we had is not the consciousness that was whole brain, holarchic, like we used to have prior to these traumata, prior to the invasion into our biology. We're not going to talk about that right now, but part of the trauma is not just pole shifts and physical ice age, physical deluge. I include in the trauma the invasion into our biology. But let's leave that aside. I assume people are familiar with my work on Atlantis. I just want to pinpoint this one thing. The ego comes in like a crutch, like a sort of muscle to hold up the whole edifice of consciousness. So what I'm talking about is that from 11,000 years to today, or from 13,500 years to today, we've been operating on one wheel. What we call ego consciousness is this unbelievably problematic, over-officious, totally, competent, incompetent, whatever way you want to look at it, problematic, mercurial ego. It's the image that you see on the first card of the tarot. The Fool and the Magician cards are basically what I'm talking about. There are two aspects. The extreme naivety of stepping out into nowhere, and then the magician, who's the orderly, organized, super-rational aspect of this ego. Another way to look at it is that you have the ocean of unconsciousness. Upon the ocean of unconsciousness, you have consciousness, which is like an island, a kind of a desert island, and that rises out of the ocean of unconsciousness like a nipple, like a breast. And then upon the breast, you have this very hardened other island, or rock, or like a lighthouse. That's how you have to look at the ego. And the ego, at the top of the ego, has a little highly focused beam of light, and that is ego consciousness. And this is a pretty accurate schemata. You have the unconscious as the protean ocean of basically what is called the unconsciousness, for want of a better word. Then out of that rises what we call consciousness, but we're not even aware of a lot of consciousness, except geniuses are. People that we would consider the genius people, they're able to go outside the gate and sort of explore consciousness. Most of us don't even get to do that. We're in the lighthouse. The lighthouse is a super hard, highly focused beam of light, like a hardened nipple, and that is where we all stay. In fact, we stay at the very pinnacle of that, the very left brain, hyper-rational, where the light is completely focused. So what that hyper-focused light allows us to do is we can make sense of a mystery, but only a very small mystery. We can focus our light very, very, very hyper-focused on one area of reality, but we sacrifice ambient awareness. So this is sort of the wave and the pulse problem that the quantum scientists have. Well, we got that in consciousness. And it's only those who are able to diffuse their ego light and spread it a little bit more around that they tend to be what we would call wise people or geniuses. The rest of us are trained in school to be so hyper-focused, so bloody super-lit, that we are geniuses in one area. Yeah, we have safety in one little area, and that we call our waking ego life. Now, because the light of that ego, Thomas, is so extremely burning bright, it's like a bright lighthouse, like a million suns. That's how the Vedic people talk about it. It's the 1,000-petal lotus. It's so bright that it burns like a battery. It runs done. So you got to sleep in the day. So that's what sleep is. Sleep is needed to regenerate those who are, like all of us, burning our batteries so brightly. And those who have speculated on this say, look, if you didn't burn so brightly, you wouldn't have to sleep as much, and you probably would die. You wouldn't die as young. But these are all, sort of side issues. Consciousness is a very important creation. But now the thing that I'm talking about is that, look, even this lighthouse can be condemned. The bulb that is on the top of the lighthouse could blow. What the hell? It's only 13,000 years old, and believe me, bulbs burn out. Look at the 16th card of the tarot. The Egyptians are going to tell you, the Celtic Egyptian tarot and their great mythologies are telling you that the consciousness is a tower that can easily be shattered by certain forces, and especially if you've already not looked after that edifice, and it's turned into an obscenity, which of course is what our minds are. There's no psychic hygiene. Well, then can't blame nature for coming in one day with a tidal wave and blowing it down. Freud has already told you that. The Freudians are already warning you. The neo-Freudians have already warned us. And this is what may be coming along the line. Now, this is all background. What does it mean? If we look around the world and see the wars, the paranoia, oh my God, bird flu, oh my goodness, internet fraud, oh no, my credit card, let's have a national identity number, let's get rid of national currency and get the Amero, let's worry about, this and that and the other. All the fear-based nonsense that people are just drugged with. When you see all of this culture of paranoia, when you see the government leviathans, whom we remember these people represent this focused light that I'm talking about, these ego representatives, when you see them all sort of doing their chaotic, crazy thing, can we please learn to take this, stand back from the canvas and understand, no, it's not just as simple as a secret society action in the world, or it's not just so simple as some mad scientists or mad, politicians. Let's do some real metaphysical research here and step back and realize something about civilization and its nature. Let's listen to what Plato and Vico and others have said, and what people like Oswald Spengler, the historian, have talked about. That history which is connected to consciousness has times when it succeeds, when it fades, when it's coming into its ending cycle. And when you look at these horrors that are happening around the world, realize that these people are representatives of a rotten ego. So when you see the dumbed-down chaos and all this toxicity that's in other people, and even it's going to start showing up in people's personal lives if it hasn't already. They're going to start seeing it. Mark my words. And it's going to be everywhere you're going to see this tidal wave. Do not get pessimistic. When you see this chaos, I don't want anybody to get pessimistic. The fact that you're seeing it for what it is means that you are actually one of the hygienic ones. You may be, in fact, one of the teachers. Because if you were part of it, you wouldn't see it. So the fact that you may lament it, by all means, be sad about it, sure. If you see something horrible, tears should fall. That's natural, that's normal. At least I know you're normal. But also realize that it puts you to realize that you are not part of it. So my words are going to those people. I'm not interested in those toxic minds and souls who are ready to be, they're taken out. Because they've been, they've been pissing in the corners of the mansion. They've been devastating the beauty and contaminating. They're squatters. I don't care what happens to them. I serve humanity, not human beings. And there's a difference. You have to think about it.